Blake Harrison was 42 years old, with a strategically sharp mind and a face that rarely allowed any interpretation other than absolute efficiency. He was the kind of man who always seemed to know the next move, as if he saw the world in charts and trends. Over the past 5 years, that clarity had led him to multiply his assets, expand business frontiers, and become a name of global respect. But inside, something was paralyzed. Since the accident that took his wife and his son Thomas, Blake's life had boiled down to two extremes: absolute control over his businesses and the unnameable chaos he avoided confronting within himself. He lived alone in a mansion that felt more like a museum of marble and silence. No employee stayed long, not because he was cruel, but because the absence of life there was unbearable for anyone who breathed emotions. Thomas's room, locked since the tragedy, was an intact capsule of memories that Blake dared not touch. Before the story continues, subscribe to the channel to follow other real, moving and transformative stories like this one. It costs nothing and makes all the difference. That Tuesday at the end of April, New York's sky was clear and Central Park pulsed with the typical midweek movement. Blake was between meetings, walking only because his driver was late, an annoyance that would normally irritate him, but that day went unnoticed. He wore an impeccable dark blue suit, noise-canceling headphones shutting out the world, while his steps were guided by a mental spreadsheet of quarterly goals, until something off-script happened. A pair of childish voices pulled him out of his orbit. "Sir, do you want to buy a toy car?" He stopped instinctively, not because of the offer, but because of the tone. There was an awkward urgency, an attempt at bravery that felt almost physical, reminding him of his son's voice. Looking at the two boys, 10-year-old twins with dirty faces and eyes far older than their years, Blake felt something he hadn't recognized in years: the impulse to pay attention. Blake hesitated for a second, staring at the toy car the boys held with both hands. It was red, with silver details already worn, but clean and carefully patched with tape on one wheel. The kind of object that once had great value to someone. "It's old, but it works," said one of the boys, Lucas, according to the small name tag sewn onto the pocket of his rumpled shirt. The other, Zach, remained silent, gripping his backpack, strapped tightly. There was something disconcerting in the sincerity of that gesture. They weren't begging, didn't extend a hand in desperation. They were selling something, trying to solve a problem. "It's to buy our mom's medicine. She's had a fever for 2 days. And there's no medicine left at home," Lucas added quickly, as if he knew every word had to be well used so as not to waste the chance. Blake, without saying anything, took his wallet from his pocket and handed over a folded bill. The boys' eyes widened. It was more than they needed, much more. Normally, Blake would have continued on his way. He would have classified that situation as a small emotional detour, a one-off, unimportant event. But there was something in their eyes, in both of them, that pulled him back. The memory of the last time he saw Thomas holding his blue truck, sitting in the back seat, laughing to himself, cut through his mind like a silent blade. Without thinking twice, he began to follow them, keeping his distance, as if trying to convince himself he was doing nothing unusual. The boys walked along busy streets, crossed 2 blocks, and entered via a side stairway into a building with peeling facade, where the smell of mildew was almost palpable, even from the outside. Blake stopped in front of the slightly ajar door of apartment 2B, where a low, female voice, coughing, echoed down the silent corridor. Blake stood before the door, listening to the muffled sound of a dry cough coming from inside the apartment. He didn't know what he was doing there. No business logic explained that impulse. No spreadsheet predicted that detour. It was as if something he had been burying for years was starting to stir, irritated by the forced silence. He took a step forward and with his fingertips pushed the door open, revealing a small room with old furniture, dingy curtains, and the smell of stale eucalyptus. On the sofa, a thin woman with dark hair plastered to her sweaty forehead tried to rise with effort. "Catherine, Even weakened, there was something of firmness in her eyes when she noticed the strange presence of a suited man in her living room. "The boys, are they okay?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Blake just nodded. Zach ran to her and held her hand gently, as if the simple touch could protect her from the world. That image stayed with Blake all the way to the hospital. He insisted on taking Catherine there immediately, despite her reluctance. He said it was the right thing to do, that he had the means and that it wouldn't cost anything. But inside, he was trying to silence a voice that had been screaming for years. The voice telling him he had failed as a father, as a man, as someone capable of protecting those he loved. Catherine was admitted with a severe respiratory infection and would need a few days of intensive care. While the doctors examined her, the boys didn't leave the waiting room. Sitting side by side, silent, they stared at the floor with the same expression of those who have waited too long for help. When a nurse asked who was responsible for the children, Blake replied without thinking, "I am." And in that moment, something inside him broke, not out of obligation, but by choice. That night, Blake's mansion received visitors for the first time in years. Not clients nor business partners, but two backpack-wearing boys with worn sneakers looking around as if entering a castle. The driver took them there at Blake's request, who stayed at the hospital, sorting out Catherine's admission. He called ahead to say the boys would spend the night at his house and left orders to prepare the smaller guest room with 2 beds, soft pillows, and well-sealed windows so they wouldn't catch a chill. When he got home later, tired, he found the living room light on and the 2 boys sitting on the sofa, watching a dinosaur movie at low volume. Neither asked how long they would stay. Neither showed surprise at the host's silence. It was as if, deep down, they knew this man had no practice talking to children, but was trying in his own way. In the following days, Blake split his time between strategic meetings and hospital visits. He arranged for a private doctor to oversee Catherine's case and hired a nurse to supervise her treatment. Expenses didn't worry him. It was the only part he knew how to handle perfectly. But what he didn't expect was the impact the boys' constant presence would have on his routine. For the first time in years, he heard laughter echoing through his corridors, muffled giggles behind closed doors, footsteps rushing toward the kitchen, voices debating whether dinosaurs had feathers or not. Lucas was curious, asking about everything from the button on the internal elevator to the paintings on the walls. Zach, quieter, observed, but when he spoke, he said things that pierced Blake's chest, like when he asked why he had so many rooms and lived alone. At first, Blake tried to maintain strategic distance. He created a rigid routine. The boys would have breakfast at 8, do school activities with the tutor he hired, lunch in the garden, and TV until late afternoon. No entering his office, no personal questions. But every attempt at control began to crumble on the 3rd day when he found the red toy car, the very one the boys tried to sell, on the dining table. Someone had cleaned it, carefully retaped the loose wheel, and left it there as a reminder. Blake stood before the toy for long minutes. He didn't know if it was an innocent provocation or a symbol of something bigger, but in that instant, he realized he was no longer the same man who had spent the last 5 years avoiding any emotional contact. Something was changing, and too fast for him to avoid. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing contracts in his office, he heard laughter coming from the kitchen. He decided to ignore it. But Lucas's laughter was insistent, full of life, and somehow penetrated the barrier Blake had worked so hard to maintain. He got up reluctantly and went to see. He found the 2 boys playing with flour on the counter. They were trying to make pancakes with the cook, who, laughing, guided them as if teaching alchemy. The kitchen was chaos, and for a second, Blake thought of complaining, but he couldn't. That simple, unpretentious scene disarmed him. He just leaned against the doorframe and watched. When Lucas saw him, he ran over with a misshapen piece of batter and said proudly, "This one's for you, Mr. Blake. It's shaped like a rocket." It was just a deformed pancake, but Blake had never received anything so genuine in a long time. That night, after the boys fell asleep, Blake entered his bedroom and locked the door as he always did. But something was different. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his own hand, the same one that gripped the wheel on the day of the accident, the same one that carried his son's lifeless body to the curb before the ambulance arrived too late. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't hold back tears. That simple gesture from Lucas, the crooked rocket pancake, had breached all the defenses he had so rigorously built. It was as if the boy's touch had opened a crack in the wall, sustaining his coldness. He wept in silence, as if trying not to hear himself. And there, unintentionally, he began the morning he had never truly lived. The next day, he woke earlier than usual. He walked through the still dark house, coffee cup in hand, and passed by Thomas's locked door. It wasn't on his route, but his feet led him there without his noticing. He stood for long minutes, staring at the doorknob. He didn't turn it, not yet, but he knew the moment was approaching. The rest of the day went as usual. The boys studied, played in the garden, asked too many questions. Catherine, still hospitalized, called every night. She spoke to the children, thanked Blake with a calmness that unsettled him. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't dramatize. She simply thanked him with serenity, as if recognizing something good in him that he himself had forgotten. And that bothered him more than he cared to admit. Because when someone sees you as good, you have to decide if you're ready to be. Blake began to get used to the sounds. Before, any unexpected noise was an intrusion. Now they were small confirmations that the house was alive. Footsteps hurrying down the halls, the refrigerator door opening carefully, the stairs creaking when Zach came down with his dinosaur book under his arm. At night, before sleeping, the boys started knocking on his door with a shy but constant, "Good night, Mr. Blake." He replied with a nod or a murmur, trying not to show that this was, little by little, becoming the best moment of his day. And though he never said it out loud, he began to notice small changes. He was sleeping better, eating more leisurely, and sometimes caught himself smiling without realizing. One afternoon, Zach appeared in the office, holding a sheet of paper. "I drew you, want to see?" Blake was on an important call, but the boy stood there silently, waiting. When the call ended, he handed over the paper. It was a child's drawing, but full of intention. Blake was in the center, wearing a tie, surrounded by two smiling boys, a big sun in the corner and a house in the background. "Did you draw this?" he asked. Zach nodded. "It's us. Me, Lucas, you, and Mom." Blake held the paper longer than necessary. He felt a knot in his throat and a chest tightness he couldn't name. It wasn't sadness nor guilt. It was belonging. That scribbled paper said more than any contract signed in recent years. It said he was, without realizing, becoming part of something again, and that both frightened and attracted him. On the 7th day since the park encounter, Catherine was discharged. Blake picked her up personally, in a gesture that surprised him more than her. He made no excuses, offered no justification. He simply showed up in his suit and contained expression, holding a bag with clean clothes the nurse had packed. When she got into the car, silence lasted until the first corner. "Thank you for taking care of the boys," she said, looking out the window. Blake responded with a slight nod, but there was something in that moment, a kind of silent understanding between two people who had seen the worst of life up close and still decided to continue. Arriving at the mansion, Catherine was moved by how the children received her. Tight hugs, questions about her cough, promises that they had behaved. Blake simply watched from afar, hands in pockets, with a strange unease in his chest, as if witnessing something too beautiful for him. In the days that followed, the house settled into a new rhythm. Catherine, though still weak, insisted on participating in the children's routine. She prepared breakfast, organized the books, read bedtime stories. She didn't complain, didn't demand. And Blake, More and more, found himself involved in small decisions he would once have ignored. Which snack to take for the picnic? Can they watch cartoons before homework? Mr. Blake, do you know how to make an eclipse with a flashlight? Gradually, the CEO who led meetings with global leaders began researching videos about constellations just to answer Lucas's questions with authority. At night, he found himself thinking about how Catherine's eyes laughed when she saw the children playing. It was a discreet but genuine laugh, and that made him remember someone he tried to forget, his wife. But for the first time, that memory came without pain. It came with longing, and that was new. It was on a Saturday morning, almost 2 weeks after the park encounter, that everything truly changed. Catherine had gone out for a follow-up appointment, and the boys were playing in the garden when Blake, without warning, stopped before Thomas's locked door. He stood there for minutes that felt like hours. Sunlight streamed through the hallway windows, illuminating the dusty frames he had avoided looking at for years. The key was still on his keyring, small, golden, nearly unused. When he turned it, the latch click sounded too loud. He opened the door slowly, as if violating something sacred, and then entered. The room was intact, the blue walls, the toys perfectly arranged, the bed made as on the last day of school before the accident. Time in there hadn't passed. But Blake, stepping onto that floor, knew he could no longer pretend that space didn't exist. Shortly after, Lucas appeared at the door. "Can I come in?" he asked, holding a plastic dinosaur. Blake nodded wordlessly. Zach followed. The two looked around respectfully, without their usual childlike restlessness. They sat on the rug, silent, as if they knew that moment required care. Blake knelt before the bed and took from under the pillow a tattered storybook. It was his favorite, he said, without looking directly at them. And then spoke of Thomas. He told how he loved rockets, how he laughed too loudly, how he invented names for the garden birds. He told of the accident, of the rain, of the noise, of the guilt that never passed. And for the first time, he didn't shrink at the sound of his own voice uttering those words. The boys listened in silence. When he finished, Lucas simply said, "I think Thomas would have liked us." And Blake, eyes brimming, smiled, because he thought so too. After that day, Thomas's room ceased to be a frozen sanctuary. It didn't become a playroom nor an ordinary passage, but a living space. Blake had the windows opened every morning, asked that nothing be moved, yet didn't mind when Zach left a drawing on the desk, or when Lucas placed his favorite dinosaur next to the action figures. It was as if, bit by bit, Thomas was sharing that space with his new visitors. When Catherine learned of Blake's decision, she simply hugged him. It was a brief, discreet hug, but full of meaning. She didn't say she was proud. She didn't praise. She just stayed there, head on his shoulder, sharing the silence. And Blake realized that this was the kind of presence he needed most. Someone who knows how to be together without invading. If this moment touched you, like the video, it helps spread stories truly worth telling. As the weeks passed, Catherine recovered her health with surprising speed. Doctors said the medication helped, but everyone there knew it was more than that. The stability, the care, the routine with the children, all seemed to make her body respond better than any antibiotic. In contrast, Blake began living confusing days. He continued running his company with the same efficiency, but the urge to rush home at day's end was new. He arrived earlier, postponed trips, left meetings for the next day. And when Catherine began talking about finding a job and resuming her life, he felt the ground shake. He said nothing, but the mere idea of them leaving made him restless. For the first time in years, he had something to lose, and that, for someone who built his life on control, was terrifying. It was in an apparently simple conversation by the estate's artificial lake that Blake realized how vulnerable he was. Catherine sat beside him, bare feet on the grass, watching the boys try to fish with bread pieces and an improvised stick. "They think they'll catch something that way," she said, laughing. Blake replied with a discreet smile, but never took his eyes off the children The silence between them was comfortable until she commented, "We're already going to look for an apartment. I don't want to overstay my welcome." He didn't answer immediately. He picked up a small stone, threw it into the water, and watched the ripples spread. Then, without looking at her, he said, "What if you stayed, not as guests, as part of this, as family?" Catherine turned her face slowly, surprised but without irony. There was too much sincerity in those words to question them. Blake had never been good with exposed emotions. He always preferred well-drafted contracts, clear terms, guarantees. But that afternoon, he felt that none of that was enough. He continued, "I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but I know that I don't want to go back to living without you. Not after all this." Catherine remained silent for a moment, watching the water, the children, and finally Blake. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded. "It's been a long time since I've been so sure of anything." She smiled, a small but meaningful smile. Zach, who had been listening from a distance unnoticed, ran over with a tiny fish caught on the improvised line. "We did it!" he shouted. Catherine hugged him, laughing, and Blake, saying nothing, bent down to help release the fish back into the lake. It was a simple gesture, but laden with symbolism. Sometimes letting something go is what allows everything to begin anew. The next day, Catherine and the boys stayed at the house, but something had changed. It was no longer a temporary stay. It was home. Lucas and Zach began calling Blake Dad without anyone instructing them. The first time was during lunch. Lucas spilled juice on the white tablecloth and, startled, looked at Blake expecting a scolding. But before he could say anything, Zach spoke. "Don't worry, Dad doesn't mind." The word hung in the air for a second. Blake swallowed hard. Catherine, across the table, watched in silence. And instead of correcting them, he simply took a napkin and began blotting the tablecloth. From that day on, Dad became routine, and although each time he heard it still stirred something deep within him, it no longer caused discomfort. It was almost as if it had always been that way. Days took on an unknown lightness. On Sundays, they played chess on the porch, made pancakes in absurd shapes, and watched films Blake never would have chosen on his own. Catherine, now healthier, helped reorganize the house, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to belong. She rearranged some furniture, brought flowers into the kitchen, filled the cabinets with colorful cups and plastic dishes the boys loved. Blake watched everything oddly at first, but soon realized each small change was a way of undoing the silent grief he had nurtured for 5 years. One day, entering the kitchen to find Catherine preparing dinner with Zach in an apron and Lucas singing a pop song off-key, Blake felt something both simple and powerful. He was home. For the first time since the accident, he was in a place where he didn't have to pretend to be strong. He could just be. It was on an ordinary night, one of those when everything seems too calm, that Blake dreamed of Thomas. It wasn't a nightmare, like the ones he used to have on the rare nights he slept deeply. There was no blood, no screams, no flashes of the accident. It was just Thomas, sitting on the floor of his room, playing with his favorite blue car. He looked at his father, smiled and said, "It's okay, Daddy. You can play with them too." Blake awoke with tearful eyes and a pounding heart, but for the first time without that weight on his chest that left him breathless. He sat on the bed, took a deep breath, and stayed there in silence, feeling his son's presence in a different way, not as pain, but as permission. As if, in some way, Thomas was saying that he could move on, that it wouldn't be a betrayal to feel joy again. The next day, Blake drove the boys to school himself. It was a simple task he could easily delegate, but he insisted on being there. When they got out of the car, Lucas hugged him and whispered, "You're the best dad we could have." Blake didn't know what to say. He simply ran his hand through the boy's hair and watched him run off with his backpack almost falling off his shoulders. Back at the mansion, he found Catherine in the living room reading. He sat beside her without saying anything. They sat in silence, sharing a peace he never imagined feeling. Again, then, as if discussing something natural, she said, "You've changed." He didn't try to deny it. He just smiled slightly and replied, "So have you." And in that instant, no more words were needed. They knew. They had built something there. Not perfect, not planned, but real. And that was enough. Blake began noticing changes even in the smallest decisions. Before, time was calculated in terms of profit, goals, meetings. Now, his schedule revolved around other priorities. Zach's school, presentation, Catherine's appointment, Lucas's upcoming birthday. And he cared, truly. At work, his partners noticed his new stance. Less aggressive, more measured. One even asked if he was ill. Blake laughed. It was strange to think his more humane version could be mistaken for weakness. But he wasn't offended. He knew what was happening. For the first time, he was balancing the empire he built with the life he almost lost. And that was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign he had finally understood what mattered. Catherine noticed it too. She watched how he communicated with the boys, still a bit stern at times, but always attentive. She saw how he checked if Lucas had a fever or if Zach was quieter than usual. She saw him begin to share the leadership of the household, asking what to cook, where to buy the new board game, which movie to choose on Friday night. Once, after a night when everyone slept late because of a marathon of old cartoons, she found Blake sleeping on the sofa, with the two boys curled up beside him. None of the three moved. The blanket had slipped and Lucas's feet were cold. She covered all three carefully without waking them and stayed there for a few minutes, watching the scene. In that instant, she understood she no longer needed to look for another life, because against all odds, she had found one, and it was right there before her eyes. By the end of that same week, Catherine decided to organize the hallway closet, one of those forgotten places full of boxes sealed for years. Blake, seeing her dusting some shelves, hesitated. "You can leave that for later," he suggested in a tone more defensive than he intended. But she just replied, "It's okay, I won't touch anything of yours," and continued. 2 hours later, the floor was covered with old photo albums, cassette tapes, childhood toys, and some pieces of baby clothes. Catherine, with all the care in the world, began sorting the items into organized boxes, separating keepsakes from excess. When Blake passed by and saw Thomas's stuffed dinosaur atop a cardboard box, something in him froze. She noticed, said nothing, just left the plush toy there in plain view, as if understanding that certain pains shouldn't be hidden, but embraced. That night, when the house was already silent, Blake approached the box. He picked up the dinosaur, hugged it to his chest, and sat on the floor, alone. It was a simple, almost childish gesture, but loaded with everything he had tried to avoid for 5 years. He remembered the stories he told Thomas at bedtime, the endless questions, the midnight cries when his son had nightmares. He remembered the last time he held him in his arms, trying to lift him out of the car before it was too late. And there, with his face buried in his hands, he wept. For the life he didn't have, for the pain he didn't share, for the longing he pretended not to feel. And after a long time, he managed to make peace with that part of himself, not as someone who forgets, but as someone who accepts. And that, for him, was already a liberation. The routine continued, but there was something different in Blake's gaze. He was no longer the armored man, whose expression seemed carved in stone. There was softness in his gestures, listening in his conversations, presence in simple moments. He began making breakfast sometimes, even if he still got the sugar wrong in the juice or burned the first slice of toast. Lucas teased him. Zach laughed. Catherine corrected him patiently, and he learned not about cooking, but about truly being there. He started working from home more often, converting one of the rooms into an office so he wouldn't isolate himself upstairs. And over time, remote meetings became a break between the truly important parts of the day. The conversations on the sofa, the drawings stuck on the fridge, the family dinners. One of those nights, Catherine came into the living room holding an envelope. It was an invitation to give a lecture at a local NGO about single motherhood and overcoming adversity. She was hesitant, "I'm not sure it makes sense. I'm not an expert in anything," she said, sitting next to Blake. He took the envelope, read it carefully, and replied, "It makes perfect sense. You survived things that would destroy many people. That's worth more than any diploma." She smiled, touched by his confidence. But what truly moved her was hearing Blake offer to drive her to the event on the day and ensure he would take care of the boys with everything they needed. That was the first time he positioned himself, spontaneously, as her partner in something not directly related to the children. It was about her autonomy, and Blake not only respected that, but encouraged it. He was learning that loving also meant knowing how to support without controlling. On the day of the lecture, Catherine was nervous. She rehearsed her speech in front of the mirror, changed outfits 3 times, asked twice if she wasn't overdoing it. Blake, sitting on the stairs with Zach in his lap and Lucas playing on the rug, just said, "You're perfect. Go and speak from your heart." She took a deep breath and smiled. She left with the posture of someone who still doubted herself a bit, but with a sparkle in her eyes, unseen for a long time. Blake spent the rest of the day with the boys, helping with homework, trying to understand how a baking soda and vinegar experiment worked, and later preparing frozen hamburgers that came out more charred than planned. But no one complained. Zach said they tasted like campfire barbecue, and Lucas declared he'd eat anything as long as there was ketchup. Blake laughed and treasured that moment as if it were gold. When Catherine returned that night, the boys ran to her with hugs and questions. They wanted to know if it had gone well, if she had become famous, if anyone cried hearing her story. She answered with laughter and hugs, and when she looked at Blake, he simply said, "I knew it." Later, alone on the porch, she recounted how difficult it was to talk about the past, how strange it was to open wounds before strangers and yet leave feeling lighter. Blake listened in silence, as he always did when something mattered. "You saved me, you know," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I was just there." And in that moment, they understood they were speaking of something greater than gratitude. It was partnership, affection, reconstruction. They didn't need formal declarations. The bond between them was already there, strong, silent, and real. With Lucas's birthday approaching, the house buzzed with anticipation. Catherine wanted something simple, just a cake and candles. But Zach insisted on organizing a super-secret mission to celebrate. Listening to the two animatedly arguing in the kitchen, Blake decided to join in. He suggested a dinosaur-themed party, the boys' favorite, and personally handled the decorations. He ordered an inflatable structure for the garden, provided matching t-shirts for everyone, including one for himself with Mr. T-Rex printed on it. When Catherine saw it, she burst out laughing. "You know they'll think you've become a kid too, right?" she teased. Blake shrugged. "I did a long time ago." And indeed, that sunny Saturday, the mansion that once stood as a monument to silence, filled with voices, music, the smell of Brigadeiro, and footsteps running every which way. The guests were few, some school friends, neighbors Catherine met at the market, a beloved teacher of the twins. But what it lacked in numbers, it made up for in affection. Lucas ran around the house wearing a paper crown and shouted in the middle of the party, "This is the best day of my life." Hearing that, Blake felt his chest tighten in a good way. Catherine watched him from afar, smiling tenderly. When the cake was served and everyone sang happy birthday, it was Blake who lit the candles, held the knife beside Lucas, and helped cut the first slice. Later, sitting on the stairs with his plate in hand, he looked around and had a certainty hard to explain. This was the life he thought he no longer deserved, but that somehow chose him back. And for the first time, he accepted it, whole. The next morning after the party, the house was a delightful mess. Balloons on the floor, confetti in the corners of the living room, colorful plates stacked in the sink. Catherine began tidying up early as usual, but Blake stopped her. "Leave it for today. It looks like the house smiled yesterday. I don't want to erase that so soon." She looked at him with silent affection. and nodded. The boys still slept, exhausted from so much excitement, and the two of them took advantage of the rare quiet to have coffee together on the porch. Catherine, barefoot with her feet on the railing, commented that she hadn't felt so whole in months. Blake didn't respond immediately. He simply poured more coffee into her cup and said, "Neither have I." And in that brief moment, between one sip and another, something solidified between them, not just cohabitation, a bond, conspiratorial, true. Later, while organizing papers in his office, Blake found the old insurance folder and documents from the car he was driving on the day of the accident. He hadn't touched it in years. Opening it, he came across the family photo, himself, his wife, and Thomas smiling in front of the school. He stared at that image for a few minutes as if seeing another life, another man. And there he was. The pain was still there, but no longer immobilizing. He kept the photo, but not at the bottom of the drawer. He placed it in a discreet frame on the office shelf. Next to it, he placed the twins' red toy car. Those two objects, so different and so connected, were now part of the same story. A story with flaws, losses, new beginnings, and finally, reconciliation. Because pain never disappears completely, but can share space with love if we let it. A few days later, Catherine called Blake for a more serious talk. They were in the library, one of the least used rooms in the house, but now a place for calm encounters between them. She held a letter in her hand, a job offer. A community center had seen her lecture and offered her a position coordinating social projects. It was a small role, but with purpose. "I want to accept, Blake, not because I want to leave, but because I need to remember who I am beyond here." He listened in silence as he did when something truly mattered. Inside, the fear of losing that routine tightened, but he knew he couldn't hold her there like a bird in a gilded cage. When she finished, he simply said, "Then go, and come back home at the end of the day." That wasn't a request, it was a promise. Catherine accepted the position, and the household dynamic changed again, but this time by choice, not tragedy. Mornings became more rushed, dinners simpler, but the sense of balance only increased. The boys adapted quickly, proud of their mother, and Blake found himself taking on tasks he never imagined, helping with homework, learning to sort clothes by color, understanding that chamomile tea with lots of honey was the universal solution for everything. And amidst it all, he remained CEO, continued managing empires, but now with his feet more grounded and his heart more available. Catherine said he had become a man with layers, like those children's books that unfold page by page to reveal a hidden world behind each flap. And Blake, upon hearing that, just smiled because it was true. On a cloudy Saturday, Zach came into the living room with an unexpected request. "Dad, can I take the red car to school on Monday? I want to show my friend that it's what brought us here." Blake was silent for a moment. That car, which he had kept as a symbol of the day everything changed, was now just a toy again, but not in a trivial sense. It was an object that circulated, that moved, that belonged to life, exactly as good memories should. He nodded. "Sure, just take good care of it," Zach promised solemnly, as if taking on a real mission. Catherine, hearing the kitchen conversation, smiled. It was beautiful to see how, in children's minds, everything made sense, and even more beautiful to see Blake opening himself to what he couldn't control. Now comment below, what moment moved you most in this story so far? I really want to know. On Sunday night during dinner, Lucas asked a question that took everyone by surprise. "Dad, if Mom marries you, will we be your real family?" Catherine nearly choked on her juice, and Blake's eyes widened. But instead of deflecting or laughing it off, he took a deep breath. He looked at Catherine, who was still processing the question, and answered firmly, "You are already my real family. But if she agrees to marry me, then it will be official." Lucas clapped. Zach's eyes went wide, and Catherine blushed. When the children ran to the living room, she turned to Blake with a look mixing surprise, affection, and laughter. Was that a proposal? He got up, went to her, and with the naturalness of someone speaking of an old plan, said, "It was, and you don't have to answer now." But Catherine, eyes shining, answered right then, "Yes, it's long overdue." The engagement announcement wasn't made with pomp, nor with social media photos. It was shared at Monday breakfast, between bites of cereal and complaints about heavy backpacks. Zach and Lucas screamed, laughed, asked if there would be a party, and if they could wear tuxedos with bow ties. Blake said they could wear whatever they wanted, as long as they didn't fight at the altar. Catherine laughed through tears. The news spread slowly among close friends, neighbors, and the few who had become part of that new circle of affection over the past months. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, became the setting for plans, flowers, music, ideas for a small wedding. Perhaps in the garden, perhaps in autumn, with few people and much sincerity. Blake, who always planned everything down to the last detail, this time only wanted it to be beautiful, not aesthetically, but emotionally. As they organized details, Catherine found a box of old letters from Blake's late wife. She read some, with his consent, and was moved. There was no jealousy there, only respect. She understood that before her there had been love, and that it didn't diminish what they were building. One night, Catherine put one of the letters back in the box and said she would be proud of who you've become. Blake didn't respond. He just hugged her tightly. It was the first time he spoke his late wife's name out loud in front of another woman. "Emma taught me to love. You taught me to go on." It was all that needed to be said. Catherine kissed him gently, as if understanding that love doesn't compete, it adds. And in that sum, everyone there had gained more than they ever imagined. The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon, with a clear sky and gentle breeze. It was in the garden, surrounded by newly planted daisies and white chairs, decorated with handmade ribbons by the children. Zach and Lucas were the first to arrive, in bow ties as promised, and distributed ceremony programs with the seriousness of those on an official mission. Catherine walked down the makeshift aisle in a simple dress of a white that seemed to illuminate everything around. Blake waited at the altar with tearful eyes and trembling hands. When she approached, he whispered, "I never thought I'd be here again." And she replied with a firm smile, "Me neither, but thankfully we are." During the vows, Blake didn't speak like an executive. He spoke as a man. "I lost everything. I thought life was over, and then you appeared, first with an old toy car, then with courage, then with love, and you made me remember who I was, and who I still can be." Catherine, eyes brimming, spoke of reconstruction, new roots, the power of finding home where least expected. Their words touched everyone present, including the house staff discreetly watching in the background, moved. When the ceremony ended and the boys ran to the couple, shouting, "Now we're a real family," Blake lifted them in the air, one in each arm. He laughed, kicked off his shoes, and there, with a sweaty face and bare feet on the grass, he seemed finally complete. It wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning. And, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He was ready. In the months that followed, the house lived its best version. Not because it was always tidy or silent. On the contrary, there were toys left in corridors, drawings on the kitchen walls, laughter echoing early in the morning. Blake began waking before his alarm just to watch the boys get up and race for the first glass of milk. Catherine resumed her work with passion and started coordinating new social projects, always returning with stories that filled the dinner table with conversation. Gradually, Blake's painful past didn't disappear but fit into place. He still visited Thomas's grave, now bringing flowers along with Zach and Lucas, who left notes and drawings. It became a light, respectful ritual, a way to keep the memory alive without giving up the present. One day, walking through the library, Blake saw the red toy car on the shelf. It was a bit dusty, but still there, whole. He picked up the toy and stood silent for a few minutes. That piece, which once symbolized loss, despair, and an unlikely encounter, now represented something completely different: rebirth. The story of that car wasn't just about two boys trying to save their mother. It was about him finding, unwittingly, a path back to himself. Blake then called Lucas and Zach into the office. He handed the car to them and said, "Keep it. Now it's yours." The boys looked at each other, surprised, and asked if he was sure. "I am, and I think it will keep working miracles." The boys laughed, promised to take good care, and ran off as if carrying treasure. Blake stayed there alone for a few seconds and realized that this was the end of a cycle. But above all, it was the start of a legacy. Blake's legacy was no longer in the figures of quarterly reports or the business accolades hanging in his office. It was in the details no one saw: the lunches lovingly packed before school, the notes left in the boys' backpacks, the coffees he brought Catherine on busy mornings. A man who once only measured success by profit now understood that his greatest achievement lived in the eyes of those who waited for him at night. And when, at a business event, he was asked, "What was the greatest strategic turnaround of your life?" he answered without hesitation, "Two boys trying to sell a broken toy car in the park." The audience laughed, thinking it a metaphor, but Blake knew it was literal, and he was the only one who didn't laugh. Zach and Lucas grew up fast, as loved children usually do, bringing curiosity, provoking reflection, demanding presence. Catherine, steadfast and sweet as ever, became a reference in her community, helping other mothers rebuild. And Blake, while maintaining his CEO position, began delegating more, not out of neglect, but because he knew time with family was his most valuable asset. One Sunday, while walking hand in hand with Catherine along the trail behind the house, he said, "I never thought I could handle all this." She replied in that calm way that disarmed him from the start. "You didn't do it alone, but you did." Blake smiled, kissed her hand, and looked ahead. The road was long, as every worthwhile journey is. But now he no longer walked alone, and even on hard days, which still came, he knew exactly where to find shelter, in the home he built unwittingly, but which today was his greatest certainty. Years later, on an autumn afternoon, Blake walked alone through Central Park. It was the same stretch where, long ago, he was approached by two determined, dirt-streaked boys offering a toy car. Now, the park was still bustling, full of running children, street vendors, and distracted tourists. But for him, that place held a different meaning. He stopped near the bench where it all began and sat for a few minutes, watching the comings and goings. In his jacket pocket, he carried a miniature replica of the red car, not the original, but one Zach and Lucas had made for his last birthday. "So you never forget our luck," said the note that came with it. Blake smiled to himself, remembering, because there, on that bench, he hadn't found luck. He had found life. While watching the surroundings, a little girl ran by and dropped a teddy bear. Blake rose automatically, picked up the toy, and called her back. "Hey, is this yours?" The girl returned, thanked him with a shy smile, and ran off to catch her parents. He sat back down, chest tight, with a gentle feeling. He realized he no longer felt the emptiness from before. He felt a kind of quiet gratitude, like someone who understands pain shaped him but didn't define him. When he returned home that night, he found Catherine on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book. The boys, now teenagers, were inside, playing video games and debating rules with the seriousness of those who take everything seriously. Blake approached, kissed Catherine's head, and whispered, "You know what I learned today? That sometimes the most important thing in life starts with a step off the planned path." Over time, Blake's story became known in restricted circles, not by him who never sought exposure, but by those who crossed his path and were touched by his transformation. Former employees, business colleagues, even executives who once feared him for his coldness began to see him differently. He was no longer just the man of precise numbers and ruthless decisions. He was the man who had rebuilt a family's life and his own. Still, Blake never wanted public recognition. He preferred the anonymity of simple gestures, paying for a promising intern's education, funding a social project Catherine recommended, listening attentively to his children's silly questions. His impact spread in invisible waves, like those he saw ripple across the mansion's lake the day he proposed to Catherine. At home, Sundays remained sacred. They were the days of poorly made pancakes, endless board games, and movie sessions. With popcorn on the sofa. One morning, while Zach tried to convince Lucas he had cheated in a card game, Blake interrupted them. "You know what I love most about our family?" The two stopped, curious, that we're not perfect, but we choose to be together every day. Catherine in the kitchen uttered an amen between laughs. That was it. They didn't come from a fairy tale. They carried traumas, losses, scars, but every day they chose to love. And that constant choice was what made it all worthwhile. Blake looked at his children, at the woman who now shared his story, and had a simple but powerful certainty. He wouldn't change a thing, not the pain, not the new beginning, because all of it brought him here. And here, finally, he was whole. One rainy November afternoon, Zach came into Blake's office with an unexpected question. "Dad, do you still miss Thomas?" The question was asked without malice, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who grew up hearing the name in whispers and seeing framed photos. Blake closed his laptop slowly, looked at his son calmly, and replied, "Every day." Zach sat next to him and remained silent for a while. "Do you think he would like us?" Blake smiled, eyes misty. "I think he would love you. You have the same brave heart." The conversation was brief, but etched in Blake's mind as one of his life's deepest moments, because at that moment, he realized there was no longer a separation between past and present. They were all there, somehow, living together in the story he now wrote every day. That same night, Blake took from the safe an item he hadn't seen in years, a small letter Thomas had written at school days before the accident. "When I grow up, I want to be just like my dad. He's strong and takes care of people." Blake held that paper with trembling hands, read and reread it as if for the first time. Catherine, seeing him like that, asked no questions. She just sat beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. "You're taking care, Blake, in your way, and he knows." The words came softly but carried weight. Blake breathed deeply, closed his eyes, and let the silence fill the space. For the first time, that letter didn't crush him. It was now a kind of blessing, a reminder that he could still be the man his son saw. And looking around, he knew he was getting there. With year's end approaching came the boys' first school performances. Zach would take part in a play about the solar system, and Lucas in a Christmas choir. Blake, who once avoided any event with crowds or sentimentality, insisted on attending everything. He arrived early, sat in the front row, filmed, took photos, and cried. Quietly, but he cried. When Zach entered the stage dressed as Mars and stumbled on his own cape, he looked to his father for reassurance. Blake raised his thumb with an encouraging smile, and the boy continued. Lucas, nervous at first, found Blake's eyes in the audience and relaxed. Catherine, beside him, squeezed his hand. It was a simple moment but full of meaning. He was no longer merely a spectator of others' lives. He was part of the plot, and the role he chose to play was the most important of all, that of a father. Back home that night, the boys asked to all sleep in the same room. "Just tonight," they said, even though they had asked that before. Blake relented, as always. They placed mattresses on the floor, made a tent with sheets and lanterns, and turned the space into an emergency space base. Catherine came in later with hot chocolate, and they all squeezed inside, laughing like children. Blake, knees cramped and in sweatpants instead of his suit, looked around and thought he never would have imagined that scene 5 years ago. There was nothing grandiose there, no luxury, no applause, but it was exactly the kind of memory that lasts forever. And inside that makeshift tent, surrounded by laughter, hugs, and silly promises, Blake had one of the greatest certainties of his life. He had finally come home. A few days later, Catherine was organizing Christmas decorations when she found an old picture frame tucked at the back of a drawer. It held a yellowed photo from Thomas's first Christmas. Blake looked younger, smiling shyly, holding their son in his arms beside his wife. Catherine carefully showed the picture to him. Want to put it on the shelf with the others? Blake looked for a few seconds and nodded. Yes, he's part of all this. Together they chose a spot on the shelf. Between children's books and a snow globe, the boys brought from the school fair. The house, once a stage for ghosts and silence, was now a space of living memory. Nothing was hidden, denied, or erased. Thomas existed in conversations, in his brother's drawings, in the way Blake hugged his children, as if there had always been someone else there, watching with pride. On Christmas Eve, the house was filled with laughter, the smell of gingerbread cookies, and a soundtrack of off-key songs sung by the boys. Catherine prepared the feast with the boys' help, while Blake tended the fireplace. When everything was ready, they sat at the table, holding hands. Catherine suggested that each say what they were grateful for that year. Zach spoke about the new school and friends. Lucas thanked for his new heart family. Catherine, eyes moist, thanked for health and courage. And finally, Blake inhaled deeply before speaking. I'm grateful to have found you. In the darkest moment of my life, you showed me there was still light, and you taught me that love doesn't end. It changes shape, but it stays here. No one replied. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was the most beautiful that house had ever heard. As days passed, Blake realized that what he built with Catherine and the boys was more than a family. It was a space of healing, not only for him, but for everyone there. Lucas, once impulsive, now showed more patience. Zach, once shy, had gained confidence. Catherine bloomed in her work, inspiring other women with her story, and he had rediscovered the capacity to feel, to care, to love without fear. Sometimes he still found himself awake at night, mind drifting between memories and plans. But now those late hours came with peace. Occasionally, he went to the boys' room just to see them sleeping. He watched their feet poking out from under the covers, their tousled hair, the involuntary smiles during dreams. And there, standing in the doorway, he felt like the most complete man he'd ever known. One night, Catherine found him like that. Blake, motionless, watching the children sleep. "Do you still fear losing all this?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. He took a few seconds to answer. "I do, but now I know that if life knocks me down again, I won't get up alone." She hugged him and replied, "You'll never be alone again." That wasn't a promise that everything would go right, but a certainty that even when it didn't, they would have. Each other, and for Blake, that was more than enough. They returned to their bedroom hand in hand, in silence, and when he switched off the light, he looked at the ceiling and silently thanked for that day, not for being perfect, but for being real. Because now he knew true happiness lives in imperfection and in the choice to stay. Months later, on a visit to the boys' school, Blake was called by Lucas's teacher for a quick chat. She wanted to show a composition he wrote on the theme, "What is a hero to you?" Blake read in silence, heart racing. In the essay, Lucas wrote that a hero isn't someone who saves the world with a cape and superpowers, but someone who takes care of you when no one else can. "My dad showed up when my mom was sick and no one wanted to help. He didn't know how to make coffee or fold clothes, but he learned everything just to see us happy. And now, he's the best dad in the world, even when he's tired." Blake finished reading with tearful eyes and a contained smile. The teacher, moved, said, "You changed that child's story." He replied sincerely, "They changed mine first." On the drive home, he was silent for a long time. Catherine noticed and touched his hand. "Are you okay?" He nodded. "It's just, sometimes it still surprises me that all this happened, that walk in the park on an ordinary day became the turning point of my life." She smiled, saying nothing, because she knew some realizations don't fit into words. When they arrived, the boys were building a science fair model and wanted to show every detail. Blake knelt beside them, praised, asked questions, got involved. What once seemed trivial was now sacred. It was the center of his world. And at the end of the night, When the boys were asleep and he and Catherine washed dishes together, he said, "If I could go back in time, I'd only change one thing. I would have found you sooner." She smiled. "We arrived when you were ready." As time went by, Blake recorded small everyday scenes as if they were treasures. A note on the fridge with a crooked dinosaur drawing, a night when everyone fell asleep on the sofa watching a bad movie, a fit of laughter at dinner because Lucas confused astronaut with herald. He kept it all, not in photos or videos, but in memory, and each memory came with the certainty that life doesn't need big events to be extraordinary. It's enough to be present. He, who once lived surrounded by walls and silence, now allowed himself to be vulnerable. He cried at movies, laughed at himself, apologized when he was wrong, and accepted help. He discovered that being strong isn't always being right, but having the courage to continue even when you don't know the next step. One quiet afternoon, while organizing old documents to archive, Blake found a hardcover notebook he hadn't seen since the early months with Catherine and the boys. Flipping through, he came across a list he himself had written. "Things I don't know how to do." Among the items were notes, like "cook, talk to children, trust someone." He laughed. He drew a line through each item. At the end of the page, he wrote, "But I learned from them." He closed the notebook and put it in a drawer calmly. It was there, between mistakes and successes, that his greatest achievement lived. And when Catherine entered the room and called him for coffee with the boys, he rose without haste. Because now he knew, real life happens in the intervals, in simple invitations, in wholehearted presence. And he was there, whole at last. On the living room shelf, beside the framed photo of Thomas and the snow globe the boys brought from school, sits the red toy car. Clean, with paint slightly worn by time, it is no longer a symbol of loss, but of new beginnings. It's the silent reminder of the day Blake, a millionaire CEO, steeped in guilt and loneliness, was torn from his routine by two determined boys and a courageous mother. And in that small, seemingly insignificant object lies the deepest turning point of his life. It wasn't a contract, a billion-dollar merger, or a brilliant idea that transformed him. It was an act of innocence, a plea for help, and the courage not to ignore it. Today, Blake doesn't live surrounded by numbers, but by stories, the scent of homemade food, drawings stuck to the fridge, and promises of the future. He hasn't forgotten what he lost, but he learned to live with what he gained. And above all, he learned to love with all he has and all he is. Enjoyed this journey? Then turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the next stories that will make you feel, reflect, and maybe even see life with new eyes.